The Story of Thumbelina. There was once a woman who wished very much to have a little child, but she could not obtain her wish. She went to an old witch and said, "I'd like to have a little child. Could you please tell me what I can do?"
"I can help you," said the old witch. "Here is a very special seed. Put it in a flower pot and see what will happen."
The woman went home to plant it. Immediately, a large and lovely tulip grew. "Oh, such a beautiful flower," said the woman, and as she kissed the red petals, the tulip opened. Within the flower sat a very graceful little maiden. She was half as long as a thumb, so the woman gave her the name of Thumbelina, or Tiny, because she was so small. One night, a large and ugly toad entered into the room through a broken window, and she saw Tiny lying in her little bed.
"She could be a pretty wife for my son,"
said the toad, and she decided to take Tiny away with her while she was still quietly asleep. The toad and her son lived in the muddy margin of a big stream. The toad's son was even uglier than his mother. When he saw Tiny, he started to call,
"Croak, croak."
The toad said,
"Don't speak so loud or she will wake. I will place her on one of the water lily leaves so she cannot escape. While she is there, we will prepare your future home under the mud."
The tiny girl woke very early in the morning and began to cry when she found she was alone and she could see nothing but water all around her. The water lily leaf was like an island because she was so very, very small. At that moment, the old toad swam out with her ugly son to the leaf on which the poor little creature cried so desperately. The toad bowed low to the little girl and said,
"Here's my son. He will be your husband, and you will live happily in the mud by this stream."
But some friendly little fishes helped Tiny to escape by gnawing the root of the leaf with their teeth. Floating along on the leaf, Tiny sailed past many towns, and the little birds in the trees saw her and sang, "What a lovely little girl." A graceful butterfly constantly fluttered round her, and at last alighted on the leaf. Tiny took off the sash she wore and tied one end of it round the butterfly and the other end to the leaf. And in this way, the butterfly was able to take little Tiny far, far away. The landscape around her became more beautiful than before. During the warm summer, the little girl lived in the forest all alone but for her friends the birds. Then the cold winter came, and all the birds who had sung so sweetly flew away to warmer climes, and the trees lost their leaves, and all the flowers withered. Her clothes were torn, and she herself was so frail and delicate that poor little Tiny was nearly frozen to death. After 2 days in the cold, she came to the little door of a field mouse. The field mouse lived in warmth and comfort, with a whole room full of corn, a kitchen, and a beautiful dining room. Poor little Tiny begged for a small piece of corn, for she was so hungry. The field mouse, who was really a good old mouse, invited Tiny to dine with her together in her home, and Tiny stayed and lived with her. One day, the mouse said,
"My neighbor, a rich mole, pays me a visit once a week. If you could have him for a husband, you would be well provided for a lifetime. But he is blind, so you must tell him some of your prettiest stories." But Tiny did not feel at all interested in marrying the mole. Be that as it may, he came and paid his visit, and he soon fell in love with Tiny. After a few days, the mole had dug a long passage under the earth, which led from his own home to a room where the mouse lived, and in this way he had permission to walk with Tiny whenever he liked.
One day he warned them not to be alarmed at the sight of a dead bird which lay in the passageway. There, in the middle of the floor, lay a dead swallow that probably died because of the cold, and it made little Tiny very sad to see it. But the mole was cruel. He pushed it aside with his crooked legs. Tiny said nothing, but when the other two had turned their backs on the bird, she caressed the swallow and kissed the closed eyelids. "Perhaps this was the one who sang to me so sweetly in the summer," she said. Then she returned home with the old mouse. During the night, Tiny got out of bed. She took a large carpet of straw and carried it to the dead swallow. The carpet of straw was as soft as wool, and Tiny covered each side of the bird so that he might lie warmly in the cold earth. "Farewell, you pretty little bird," said Tiny in tears. Then she laid her head on the bird's breast, but she was immediately alarmed. She heard the bird's heart beat. He was not really dead. He was alive, but very weak, and one of his wings was broken. The sick swallow opened his eyes and said, "Thank you, pretty little maiden. I have been so nicely warmed. I'll get well soon and be able to fly again in the warm sunshine when the spring will come." Tiny said, "Stay in your warm bed. I will take care of you." During all those months they became close friends. Neither the mole nor the mouse knew anything about it, for they did not like birds. Very soon the springtime came, and the sun warmed the earth once more. The swallow asked Tiny if she might go with him, but Tiny felt very sorry for the mouse who had been so kind to her, so she said, "No, I cannot." Tiny said farewell to the swallow, and the tears rose in her eyes. The bird flew into the sky, and Tiny felt very, very sad. One day, the old field mouse said, "You are going to be married, Tiny. My neighbor the mole has asked for your hand. Now we will prepare your wedding clothes." So the wedding day was fixed. The mouse hired 4 spiders who were to weave both day and night all of Tiny's wedding clothes. Every evening the mole visited Tiny and was continually speaking of the time when the summer would be over. Tiny did not care for the mole, nor did she want to marry him. The mole was going to take Tiny away to live with him deep under the earth, never again to see the warm sun, because he did not like it. "Farewell, bright sun," Tiny cried. Suddenly she heard tweet, tweet over her head. There was the swallow himself, flying in the sky above her. In tears, Tiny told him how desperate she felt to marry the tiresome old mole and never to see the bright sun any more. "Fly with me, dear little Tiny. You saved my life when I lay frozen in that dark place," said her friend. "We can fly into warmer countries where the sun shines every day." "Yes, I will go with you. Take me away, my friend," said Tiny, and she seated herself on the bird's back. After 3 days, they reached the warm countries where the sun shines brightly. "This is where I live," said the swallow. "Now you should choose for yourself one of those amazing flowers, and I will put you down upon it where you can be happy." Between 2 large pieces of marble grew the most beautiful silver flowers. So the swallow placed Tiny on one of their leaves. Tiny was surprised as she saw standing in the middle of the flower a little man, as white and transparent as if he had been made of crystal. He had a gold crown on his head and delicate wings, and he was just as tiny as Tiny herself. He was the spirit of the flower, for every silver flower had its own spirit, and this little creature was the king of them all. "Oh, how beautiful he is," whispered Tiny. He was delighted, and thought her the prettiest little maiden he had ever seen. He placed his gold crown on Tiny's head and asked her if she would be his wife and queen of all the silver flowers. She joyfully answered yes to the handsome king. Then all the flowers opened, and out of each came either a little lady or a tiny lord, all so pretty it was quite a pleasure to look at them. Each little creature brought Tiny a wedding present, but the best present of all was a sparkling pair of beautiful wings, which had once belonged to a large white butterfly, so that Tiny might fly from flower to flower. "You deserve a better name than Tiny," said the little king. "Because you are so pretty, we will call you Maya." The swallow himself sang a wedding song for them, and they all lived in joy and peace ever after. The end.